All right, welcome back to New Testament Survey. As we continue our study through the books of the New Testament, we're going to continue with the book of Romans, which of course is Paul's magnum opus of presenting the gospel. We're going to subtitle this Righteousness in Christ from chapter 1, verse 17, which we'll look at later as the key verse or one of the key theme verses for the entire book. But the book of Romans is essentially the gospel itself in very, very detailed legal terms that only the lawyer Paul himself could have put together. He says that it is the gospel that is the righteousness of Christ, that is the righteousness of God being revealed through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. We'll see that again as we go through the book a little bit more. First of all, the author is, of course, Paul himself. Even liberal critics do not question this, as, again, just like 1 Corinthians and the book of Galatians, these are considered Pauline canon. This is, if you've ever studied Shakespeare, you know that regardless of whether or not there was a real Shakespeare or not, even liberal critics would say Romeo and Juliet is Shakespeare. It's Shakespearean canon. Whoever it is that wrote that is Shakespeare himself. So whoever it is that wrote Romans is Paul, regardless of the historicity of Paul being questioned. So as we look at this, there's no reason to deny that. Of course, Paul recognizes himself right at the very beginning from verse 1 as the author. The recipients, of course, the church at Rome was a very pivotal, very key church for Paul to make contact with, but we need to understand that the church itself was not founded by Paul, nor was it founded by Peter, as is claimed by the Catholic Church. Instead, the only biblical statement that we have about the church or Christianity or even the gospel going to Rome is in Acts chapter 2, knowing that there were Jews in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost who heard the gospel spoken by Peter, who then took it back to Rome. Now, there were perhaps other converts of Paul's. We see throughout at the very end of the book of Romans an extensive list of names of people that Paul knew that he was greeting. Probably people that had we know, like Priscilla and Aquila, for instance, had been in the book of Acts, chapter 18. He meets them there in Corinth. They travel with him to Ephesus. He ministers and serves with them in Ephesus. He's greeting them. Perhaps they've returned to Rome at that point. And so many of his other converts from other cities are there in Rome. Lots of people traveling back and forth to Rome. But it's important to understand that there wasn't necessarily an apostolic founding of the church in Rome. And so Paul does not go beyond what he says in other books where he says, I don't build on another man's foundation. So he's not treading on someone else's territory by writing to the Romans, though he does not know them personally. He seeks to have a blessing amongst them. And of course, as he's writing this, also says that he seeks to come to them and visit and have influence over that church eventually, probably with the anticipation that it would be that the city of Rome itself, of course, the capital of the Roman Empire, would then be a further jumping off point of the gospel. He then says, even at the end of the book of Romans, that he then intends to go on to Spain from Rome, just as his tactic is, establishing a gospel center in Ephesus to reach all of Asia Minor, establishing a gospel center in Corinth to reach all of Achaia, gospel centers in Philippi and Thessalonica to meet to reach Macedonia. This is really Paul's pattern here, and probably was his plan before, of course, his Roman imprisonment derailed that plan. The city itself, not much to speak of other than the fact that this is the Rome itself, the capital of the Roman Empire, situated on 7 hills, which we see is pictured prophetically in the book of Revelation. Population in the first century was could have been as much as 4 million people, vast majority of whom were slaves. There were slaves there. There were freedmen there. There were Jews. There were Gentiles all throughout the city. Hundreds of temples, both to Roman gods, to conquered peoples. Lots of wealth, lots of influence in the city of Rome. It's at this time Nero is ruling in the city of Rome, although it's very early in Nero's reign, as Nero is a young man. This is prior to the persecution that brought about Paul's first Roman imprisonment, or even his second Roman imprisonment that would then lead to his martyrdom in the city of Rome. And so obviously prior to the fire that started that persecution. Here's a nice little map of the city. You'll also see this in your class notes. Not much here to help us understand the book itself, but it is nice to kind of see that this is what Rome would have looked like in those days. All right, as we continue on here, the date and circumstances of writing. Paul is in Corinth on his third missionary journey and is writing. In fact, he sends this with Phoebe, who he calls a minister or a servant in the church at Cenchrea, which is just south of the city of Corinth. And so he takes that during his third missionary journey, sends this to Rome. Of course, we know from 2 Corinthians that he then plans to go back to Jerusalem with the gift for the Jerusalem church from Corinth, and he does. We see that in the book of Acts, and then eventually would then go to Rome. Of course, he goes to Rome as a prisoner rather than as a freed person, but eventually he does get to Rome in his first Roman imprisonment. The purpose then, to prepare the way for an eventual visit to the well-known church. We've talked about that. To give the church a clear and extensive exposition of the doctrine of justification by faith. This letter itself is kind of considered Paul putting down his apostolic authority, saying, this is my gospel. This is the gospel of Paul that needs to be preached in the city of Rome, preparing the way for his eventual visit, putting forth his doctrine of justification by faith. Of course, not just Paul's gospel, but the gospel of Jesus Christ. And to provide a foundational material for living in the Christian life. Of course, chapters 12 through 16, very detailed about how to live out the Christian life, how to live out the gospel, and to show how God's blessing of Gentiles could correspond with the covenant promises given to Israel. Chapters 9 through 11 dealing with how it is that God has set aside Israel at this time for this period of time where God is now going to bless the Gentiles with the gospel. This really fits into the circumstances of writing in the book of Romans, because as we learned in the book of Acts, that under Domitian, the Jews had been kicked out of the city of Rome, and it's very likely that during the period of time when the Jews were kicked out of Rome, that Gentiles had taken over leadership positions in the church. And as those Jews came back into Rome, there was perhaps some going back and forth about who should be in charge. And Paul's writing to them saying, hey, listen, the Gentiles are now the custodians of the gospel, not taking anything away from the Jews, because they're the ones that the gospel belongs to, that it comes from, because they were given the oracles, they were given the Old Testament and all of the promises. So we're going to pause this video here. We'll go on into video number 2 to finish up the book of Romans.